Some woman from around the lake who seemed to have appointed herself as the neighborhood's ruling force came up to me one morning and declared I wasn't allowed to fish behind my own house. She said it was against community standards, whatever that was supposed to mean. Within a week, I started getting fake notices taped to my front door, bogus fines, even rumors about my property being taken away. Neighbors suddenly turned cold, avoided eye contact, and when I asked who exactly had made these rules, they either changed the subject or muttered, "That's just how things are here." That's when it became clear. This wasn't about rules, it was about control. Comment if you've ever had to deal with someone who acts like they run the entire neighborhood. It was early morning, about the time the mist still lingers over the lake, and I was heading down with my fishing rod, thinking about nothing more than whether the bass were biting. I run a tackle shop in town, so these early hours on the water aren't just for peace and quiet, they're part of my work. Birds were calling, the water looked perfect, and then I saw her, Heather Collins, standing in my driveway with a cheap reflective badge pinned to her blazer like she was about to direct traffic at the county fair. She clutched a clipboard to her chest as if it contained state secrets, blocking my way like she was guarding Fort Knox instead of a fishing spot. "Excuse me, sir," she said, and instantly I recognized that tone, the voice people use when they're about to tell you your dog is too loud or your grass is an inch too tall. She introduced herself as Heather Collins, president of the so-called Lakeside Homeowners Association, and informed me that I was standing on private property. She waved that clipboard like it was a magic wand meant to make me vanish. I paused and looked at her badge, and something seemed off. The plastic was scratched, the corners bent, and when I focused on the tiny text at the bottom, I noticed the expiration date. "This expired 2 years ago," I told her. She yanked it back like I'd insulted her family heirloom, but not before I got a good look. And honestly, what HOA was she even talking about? In all my years here, I'd never gotten a single letter. No bylaws, no meetings, nothing. No welcome packet about mailbox colors or lawn heights, just silence. Heather started scribbling furiously on her clipboard, muttering about lake violations, inventing codes out of thin air. Then she ripped out a yellow slip and held it out to me like it was an official citation. I didn't take it. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. My gut told me this was about to get interesting. She claimed I owed a $50 lake access fee for non-residents and that since my name wasn't on their membership list, I'd have to pay up before stepping foot near the water. I nearly laughed in her face. She was standing in my own driveway telling me I couldn't use the lake I'd fished for months. Moments later, a locksmith van and a tow truck pulled up. Apparently, Heather had called them to remove my car for blocking HOA emergency routes. The locksmith got out, took one look at the property stakes marking my land, and left without a word. The tow truck driver shook his head and said, "Ma'am, we can't tow a car from someone's own driveway. You'll need a lawyer for that." Both of them drove off. Heather flailed her arms, shouting about liability and county codes, but no one paid attention. Across the street, Sophie Clark stood on her porch with her coffee, watching the whole scene like it was a live show. She gave me a sympathetic shrug that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood drama." Meanwhile, George Miller from across the road stood with his arms crossed, nodding at every word Heather said like he was her personal cheerleader. Heather huffed, tucked her clipboard under her arm, and announced she'd be reporting this incident to the neighborhood forum. She also mentioned there would be a community meeting the following week to discuss penalties for repeat offenders. Then she stormed off to her spotless silver sedan. I was left standing there, fishing rod tangled in line, wondering why this stranger thought she had authority over my lake. The whole thing felt surreal, like I'd been scolded by a fake mayor of a town that didn't exist. From that point on, I decided I'd record every encounter. Something told me this was only the beginning. The very next day, things escalated. Instead of phony citations, Heather found a new way to harass me. Somehow, she got hold of my personal information and began calling my tackle shop directly. She told customers I was under investigation for environmental violations, hinting they should think twice about supporting someone who disrespects community standards. I watched 3 regulars put down their purchases and walk out without a word. That's when I realized she wasn't just annoying, she was trying to ruin me. I couldn't believe how far this woman was willing to go just to pressure me into giving in. Every cancelled order at my shop felt like a calculated strike, meant to make resisting her demands costlier than simply handing over money for her bogus fees. I bought this land because it reminded me of mornings spent fishing with my father, back before chemo stole his strength and voice. He used to wake me before dawn, and we'd drive out to Miller's Pond with a thermos of coffee and old tackle boxes that smelled like rust and hope. The lake here carries that same stillness, of that same quiet promise that the world's noise can't touch you. After Elaine passed 3 years ago, the city became unbearable. The noise wasn't just loud, it was cruel. Every honking horn reminded me of hospital machines. Every siren pulled me back to nights when the ambulance arrived too late. Out here, though, the silence feels different. It doesn't cue, it listens. It leaves space for conversations with the ghosts I still carry. When I first came here during the county auction preview, walking along the shore loosened something inside me for the first time in months. This place wasn't just real estate, it was sanctuary. The tackle shop gave me work for my hands, but the lake gave me a place to leave my grief so my heart could learn to beat again without breaking. Every sunrise on this water was therapy without words. But Heather wasn't done. She uploaded photos to the neighborhood forum, claiming they showed environmental damage caused by unauthorized fishing. When I checked the metadata on those photos, I realized they weren't even taken near my property. She'd gone all the way to the far shore to snap pictures that made it look like I was dumping trash and disturbing wildlife. That's when I started wondering, was she confused about property boundaries, or was she deliberately twisting things to her advantage? Either way, I decided to respond in kind. I began documenting the same areas myself, from multiple angles, with timestamps proving her photos were weeks older than when I even started fishing regularly. Around then, my old friend Mark Lewis gave me a call. We'd gone to college together, and now he runs a real estate law practice downtown. "Daniel," he said, "I saw Heather's post on the forum. We need to talk. You didn't just buy Lake Accessa, you bought the entire parcel at auction." That stopped me cold. At the courthouse auction 6 months earlier, I thought I was bidding on a small lot with access rights. The paperwork was filled with compass bearings and surveyor terms that meant nothing to me at the time. "What do you mean, the whole parcel?" I asked. "I mean you own everything including the lake itself. Heather has zero authority over it," Mark replied. That revelation hit just as Heather ramped up the pressure. According to her latest violations, I had 3 days to respond or face fines and legal action. After that, I'd have 10 days to file an appeal with the HOA governance board, and following that, a community meeting where residents could vote on stricter penalties for repeat offenders. The entire document read like something pulled off the internet, a half-baked template filled with legal-sounding phrases. But what worried me most was that my neighbors seemed to be taking her seriously. George Miller started glaring at me every time I walked to my car. A stranger yelled, "Pay your fees." While I checked my mailbox, Heather's newest forum post was all about habitat protection and nesting season regulations. She'd found real state environmental guidelines about protecting wildlife during breeding seasons and twisted them into an excuse for her lake restrictions. "As responsible community stewards," she wrote, "we must prioritize the ecological health of our shared natural resources over personal recreational wants." The post even included photos of birds near the water and a long passage about sustainability that sounded like it was lifted from a brochure at a nature preserve. Looking back, I should have realized she was setting the stage for an environmental crusade to make her claims sound legitimate. But at the time, all I could think about was how she kept calling the lake our shared resource when, according to Mark, it was actually mine. So I started carrying my phone everywhere, documenting everything, every run-in with Heather, every word from neighbors, every forum post. Maybe I was paranoid, but it felt like things were building toward a moment where everyone's memory would suddenly become very selective. Sophie Clark mentioned casually that she'd been paying lake access fees for the past 2 years, which meant Heather wasn't just harassing me. She'd been collecting money from multiple neighbors for access to a lake that, if Mark was right, legally belonged to me. That realization made me wonder just how much she'd pocketed over the years and how much of her perfect landscaping was being paid for with those so-called fees. Over the past year, George Miller cornered me in the grocery store, trying to pitch what he thought was a fair compromise to our community dispute. "Look, Daniel," he said, blocking the aisle to the checkout with a cart loaded with organic produce and brand-name cleaners. "Nobody wants drama here. Why don't you just pay the fee and join the association? It's not really about money, it's about being part of something bigger than yourself." He looked at me with this earnest expression, like he truly believed paying Heather's made-up fees would magically fix everything and restore harmony to our little lakeside neighborhood. "George," I asked, "has anyone ever actually seen HOA paperwork, incorporation documents, bylaws, anything official?" For a split second, his face went blank, then he shrugged. "Heather takes care of all that stuff. I just know it helps keep property values high." That evening, the lake was like glass, reflecting the last streaks of sunset like a mirror filled with secrets. I stood by the water, remembering my father's hand over mine, teaching me to cast, remembering Elaine's laugh echoing across the stillness. But that night felt different. The air was heavy, electric, and the kind of quiet that settles in right before a storm. Even the birds seemed to sense it. My gut told me something was about to shift, something that would test whether this place could stay the sanctuary I had fought to create. Mark was right about the parcel I owned. It was bigger than I realized, but something in me knew Heather wasn't bluffing out of ignorance. She had an angle I hadn't seen yet. By the time the emergency community meeting was called, the tension had reached its peak. The community center hadn't been this packed since the annual bake sale. Heather had plastered flyers on mailboxes, utility poles, and bulletin boards, framing me as a one-man threat to the entire lakeside ecosystem. When I walked in, about 30 neighbors were crammed into folding chairs. Most looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Sophie Clark caught my eye from the back row and gave me a quiet nod of support. George Miller, of course, was right up front, already scribbling on his yellow legal pad like he was taking minutes for the Supreme Court. At the front of the room, Heather had set up her stage. A folding table served as her command center, covered in poster boards with pie charts, a laptop hooked to a projector, a stack of manila folders, and that same clipboard she'd carried since the start, except now she'd accessorized with what appeared to be official county paperwork. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, tapping her pen against the microphone until the chatter died down, "we're here tonight to confront a very serious threat to our community values and to the preservation of our shared natural resources." The way she said it, you'd think I'd been dumping barrels of toxic sludge instead of quietly fishing off my own shoreline. I pulled out my phone and started recording. I had a feeling this performance would be worth keeping. "This individual," she said, literally pointing at me, "has repeatedly violated the Lakeside Community Covenant, ignored numerous citations, and continues to trespass on property that belongs to all of us." The murmurs began immediately. Heads turned. Some people looked at me with confusion, others with genuine worry. I had to admit Heather knew how to work a crowd. She made herself sound calm and reasonable while painting me as the reckless outsider. "Furthermore," she continued, clicking to the first slide of her presentation, "I have photographic evidence of environmental destruction caused by these unauthorized activities." The projector lit up with images of trash along the shore, trampled plants, and even what she claimed were unauthorized fire pits creating wildfire hazards. That's when I stood. I hadn't planned on interrupting, but staring at those photos flipped a switch inside me. "Excuse me, Heather," I said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Can you tell us when exactly those pictures were taken?" She froze mid-sentence, caught off guard. Heather clearly hadn't expected me to cut her off. "The dates are in the metadata," she shot back, though her voice had lost some of that earlier authority. I walked right up to the front, pulled out my phone, and connected it to her projector. "Actually," I said, "let me show everyone something I found." I'd spent the afternoon getting ready for this moment, gathering proof that told a completely different story. The first image that popped onto the screen was a receipt from the Lakeside Community Fund. It showed a $200 payment for environmental cleanup and maintenance. The vendor's name stood out plain as day: Miller Landscaping and Irrigation. The next photo showed the same company logo on the side of a truck parked in a neighborhood driveway. The third photo, that exact truck parked in Heather's driveway while workers installed what looked suspiciously like a high-end sprinkler system for her yard. The room went dead quiet. You could hear a pin drop. George Miller's face had gone pale, and he was staring down at his legal pad like he was hoping it would open up and swallow him. "So let me get this straight," I said, drumming my fingers lightly on the podium. "Neighbors have been paying into this so-called lake fund for environmental protection and the money ends up paying for landscaping at your house?" Heather stammered about legitimate contractor services and proper stewardship, but the crowd wasn't buying it. Sophie Clark shook her head in disbelief, and even some of George's usual supporters leaned toward one another, whispering. I could see the exact second when the room turned against her. It was like watching dominoes topple one after another. "This lake has always belonged to me," I said firmly, letting that sentence hang in the silence. "And I've got the paperwork to prove it. But what I want to know is how long has this fund been running, and how much money are we talking about?" Heather started fumbling through her folders, desperate to find something to salvage her story, but the images on the screen had already sealed her fate. Miller Landscaping, as it turned out, was George's brother-in-law's business, which explained his unwavering loyalty to her. What looked like an HOA was really a neighborhood racket, with environmental protection as the perfect disguise. The meeting unraveled fast after that. Neighbors demanded to see financial records, asked for incorporation papers, and treated Heather like someone caught red-handed. She tried to regain control by threatening special assessments and tougher enforcement, but the power was gone. Those 3 photos had shredded her credibility in less than a minute. Eventually, she packed up her props, muttered about stronger legal measures, and stormed out of the community center like a defeated general retreating from a lost war. I stayed behind to answer questions, and that's when I realized just how deep this scam went. Sophie admitted she'd been paying $50 a month for 2 years. Another neighbor said he chipped into a dock maintenance fund that never fixed a single dock. Someone else claimed they'd paid into a wildlife restoration project which, from the looks of things, had turned into new plants in Heather's front garden. The math was staggering. Thousands of dollars had been funneled into Heather's property under the guise of community stewardship. My photos had exposed her, but I had no idea what she'd do next. Part of me wondered if I'd just woken up a monster. The next morning, I went straight to the county clerk's office and demanded every scrap of paperwork tied to my property. No loopholes, no anadromist. The clerk, a woman who looked like she'd been managing files since the day the building opened, guided me through the labyrinth of cross-reference deeds and maps. "You want parcel number 478, she said, sliding a thick folder across the counter. "County auction. Last spring, you were the winning bidder." When I laid the survey map out and circled the lake with a red marker, the truth was undeniable. My land didn't just include shoreline rights, it covered the entire lake plus a 50-foot buffer zone around it. The legal description spelled it out in black and white: water rights, mineral rights, and recreational rights. All mine. I printed 20 copies and started knocking on doors. First stop was Mark Lewis. He scanned the papers, let out a low whistle, and said, "Daniel, you own the lake outright." Heather's been bluffing without a shred of legal authority. Next, I went to Sophie Clark. She invited me in, and I laid the survey in front of her. "So the fees I've been paying for 2 years a broken bar," she said slowly, her eyes narrowing as she traced the map with her finger. "They weren't even legitimate." When I showed her the county stamps and official seals, her face shifted through a range of emotion to confusion, anger, and finally something close to relief. "If what you're saying is true, then we've all been lied to." "But Danielle, a broken bar, some people have been paying these fees for years. This is going to crush those who truly believed they were doing the right thing." George Miller was a different story. When I showed up at his door with my folder of evidence, he only cracked it open enough to glare through the chain lock. "You're tearing apart our community order," he snapped, as if I were personally responsible for dragging chaos into suburbia. "George, your order is built on fiction," I replied, holding up the county papers so he could see the official seals. "There is no HOA. There never has been. Heather has been taking money under false pretenses, and I have the proof right here." But George didn't care about facts. He cared about protecting the illusion that gave him some sense of order, even if that illusion cost him money and gave Heather unauthorized power over everyone's lives. The door slammed before I could finish explaining the legal fallout. Later, as I stepped away from Sophie's porch after sharing what I'd uncovered, Heather was waiting at my truck. She leaned against the driver's door, phone in hand, pretending to document me like I was committing a crime. "So now you're intimidating residents?" she sneered. "I'm sharing public information with my neighbors," I said evenly, forcing calm against the adrenaline spike. "Information proving you've been running a fraudulent organization for years." She fired back with threats of harassment charges, restraining orders, but her eyes betrayed the panic. She knew I had uncovered something that could unravel her scheme, and she was scrambling to regain control. Meanwhile, my surveillance equipment was capturing everything. I had motion-activated cameras at 3 angles, night vision included. The most damning footage showed supplies from the so-called Lake Fund projects, soil amendments, decorative stones, expensive plants being delivered after dark, straight into Heather's backyard. Red camera lights blinked as trucks unloaded what was clearly for her personal garden, not community spaces. The timestamps matched suspiciously with the collections from residents. Standing at the intersection of 3 neighborhood streets that night, I opened my notes app and typed out a precise, detailed summary. I planned to read it aloud at the next gathering, holding up the deed with its county seal for all to see. "This is the truth. They've been bluffing with a fake HOA. No board, no vote, no legal standing, just fear tactics and manufactured authority." I saved the draft alongside copies of the survey documents and county auction records. Within hours of posting it on the neighborhood forum, chaos erupted. The comment section exploded at questions, accusations, demands for Heather to show proof. Some defended her, claiming I was trying to privatize community resources. Others finally started asking the real questions. Where were the bylaws, the incorporation papers, the financial statements? The personal toll was heavier than I'd expected. 2 neighbors stopped speaking to me altogether, crossing the street when they saw me coming. One of my tackle shop customers bluntly asked whether I was really trying to privatize the lake, just as Heather had claimed online. Even Sophie seemed cautious, lowering her voice whenever we spoke, glancing around like we were conspiring to break the law. The social pressure was constant, and I could see how someone less stubborn might have just paid the fees to avoid it all. That evening, I met Mark for coffee, and his insight cut straight to the point. "The photos speak for themselves," he said, scrolling through the surveillance footage and the documents Sophie had helped gather. "But you need to be ready for the next phase. People like Heather don't go down quietly. She's invested too much in this scheme to let it collapse without a fight." He was right. The contractor connections, the money trail, the fake authority, all of it pointed to someone who had built her entire identity on controlling the neighborhood. "She's going to escalate," Mark warned, "probably push for a restraining order or some legal injunction. She'll try to buy herself time. If she can't win with facts, she'll stall the game until she can rewrite the rules." I hadn't thought of it that way, but it made perfect sense. And sure enough, that night my mailbox filled with threats. One of them wasn't even anonymous. On expensive stationery, in neat handwriting, Heather had written, "You think you've won? Let's see how you handle what comes next." Heather's letter had been blunt. "Let's see how you handle public backlash when everyone knows who you really are." The threat was sharp, personal, and told me everything I needed to know, as she was willing to go as far as it took to protect her fabricated authority. This had moved beyond money. It was about power, control, and the lengths someone will go to in order to defend a lie they've lived inside for years. Every piece of evidence pointed the same direction. Heather had built an elaborate scam, using the language of environmental concern and community spirit as a disguise for her own gain. But walking out of that cafe copyright, I couldn't shake the feeling I was stepping into a trap she had been setting since the day I challenged her expired badge. The real question wasn't whether I was smart enough to expose the scheme, it was whether I was strong enough to withstand what she'd do once she realized the game was ending. That night, the lake glittered under the streetlights, reflecting like scattered diamonds, a beautiful, but deceptive. The next meeting wasn't at the community center. It was in George Miller's living room, which should have been my first clue that this was no ordinary gathering. Heather had persuaded him to host what she framed as a mediation session, a chance to settle things peacefully before they spiraled. When I stepped inside, 15 neighbors were seated in a circle, like we were about to begin group therapy. Heather sat at the head of the room with a fresh folder of papers, projecting calm confidence she hadn't turned after the disaster at the community hall. Sophie caught my eye from across the circle, her face tight with concern, while George shuffled around with coffee and cookies, pretending this was some friendly get-together rather than a setup. "Before we begin," Heather said, adopting a soothing, almost counselor-like tone, "let's agree on a few ground rules for open and constructive dialogue. We're here to find common ground and clear up the misunderstandings that have divided us." Her performance was polished, but transparent. This wasn't about healing rifts, it was about boxing me in, making me feel pressure to compromise in front of everyone just to avoid further conflict. I wasn't about to play along. "That sounds reasonable, Heather," I said, setting my briefcase carefully on George's coffee table. "But before we talk about resolution, I've got a few questions. First, where exactly did you get the authority to speak on behalf of this neighborhood? Can you show us the legal paperwork that names you president of the Anadrama Nest? And second, what official survey are you using to define lake access and boundary rights?" The room fell into an uneasy silence, the kind where everyone knows the questions are valid but no one dares say them out loud. Heather shuffled her papers, clearly buying time, unprepared for a challenge she couldn't script her way out of. That's when I laid down my trump card. I opened the briefcase and spread out the stamped county documents and the official boundary survey papers showing exactly what I had purchased at the auction. "If we're talking about facts," I said, pushing the documents into the center of the table, "here are some you can verify for yourselves." The county seal gleamed on every page. The surveyor's signature was bold, the legal description exact. The truth was undeniable. I now own the entire parcel including the lake and a 50-foot buffer on all sides. The reaction was instant. George dropped his coffee. Sophie's jaw fell open. Two neighbors spoke over each other, insisting on seeing the papers, but the most revealing reaction came from Heather. She didn't look shocked, she looked cornered, like someone so deep in a lie they'd nearly convinced themselves it was real. "Those documents don't override existing covenant obligations," she stammered. "Property ownership doesn't cancel out prior community agreements." Her voice, once commanding, now sounded thin, strained. She was grasping for any loophole that might preserve her authority, but the room could see her unraveling. "What covenant are you talking about?" I asked, rising to address everyone, not just her. "Has anyone here ever seen the original Anadrama Nest Incorporation papers? Has there ever been a legitimate election for neighborhood leadership? Has anyone received financial reports explaining where the so-called lake fund money has gone?" The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation I could make. Neighbors glanced at one another, the truth dawning on them they had trusted without question. The neighbors had been following Heather's authority for years without ever seeing real proof that it existed. I could feel the shift in the room the moment it happened. Heather was no longer the calm leader in charge. She was suddenly the one with a lot to explain. I walked outside and began driving red boundary stakes into the ground around the lakefront in full view of everyone. Each stake carried a metal tag with survey coordinates, placed precisely where the county documents showed my property lines extended. That simple physical act of claiming the land with visible markers spoke louder than any piece of paper could. People followed me as I circled the lake, hammering in stake after stake, their eyes fixed on every move. When I planted the last one with extra force, I said, "This is my land, and I've got the documentation to prove it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize it. The papers and the red stakes told the story on their own, but Heather wasn't done yet. As I packed away my surveying gear, she suddenly produced what she claimed were temporary restraining orders blocking me from accessing the lake for environmental assessment. "The county has issued a temporary restriction while wildlife experts evaluate potential habitat damage caused by unauthorized activities," she declared, holding up the papers like they were gospel. The documents looked official in HOA stamps, signatures, the works, but something about the timing was off. How could she have brought in environmental authorities so quickly? And why hadn't I received any notice of an assessment? The pride I had felt moments earlier from planting those stakes drained away. While I was focused on proving ownership, Heather had been setting the stage for a completely different battle. Environmental protection. That was the one loophole where private property rights could be overruled in favor of public interest. If she managed to convince the county that my fishing or land use threatened nesting birds or fragile habitats, she could shut me out of my own property. It was clever, infuriatingly clever. And it caught me flat-footed. I'd told similar cases on Anadrama Nest before, stories of people manipulating the system with fake authority and fabricated crises. But this time, I wasn't the storyteller watching from the outside. I was the one caught inside the trap. The grin on Heather's face as she handed over those papers told me everything. She had planned this angle from the very beginning, since the moment I called her out on that expired badge. The habitat protection narrative, the timing with nesting season, it had all been prepared for this precise move. Now I stood on land I legally owned, marked by my red stakes, while holding papers that said I couldn't set foot there. The chess match had entered a new stage, and Heather had revealed herself as more dangerous than I'd imagined. Would my proof of ownership hold up stronger than her fabricated environmental crisis, or did she have more pieces already in place for the next round? I didn't have to wait long to find out. Overnight, barriers went up, not just a bit of tape or a few warning cones, as a full-scale barricades with orange mesh fencing, official-looking no trespassing signs, and citations of county wildlife protection codes. By morning, an entire environmental enforcement unit appeared on my property, a trucks marked Habitat Assessment Division, workers in reflective safety vests, and equipment that made the lakefront look less like a fishing spot and more like a hazardous waste cleanup site. The transformation was so fast, so polished, that for a brief second I wondered if I had been wrong. Had there really been an environmental threat I missed? But the community's reaction didn't leave me space to reflect. Suddenly, I wasn't just the stubborn guy refusing Anadrama Nest fees. I was the reckless landowner destroying nature, the villain who had forced the county to intervene. George Miller spread rumors at the grocery store about serious ecological damage he'd seen. 2 of my best customers canceled their lure orders, saying they couldn't support someone who didn't care about conservation. Sophie, who used to greet me warmly, now avoided my eyes in public. When I waved, she turned her head like she was ashamed to even know me. But while Heather was winning the narrative, I still had my edge: the surveillance cameras. And what they recorded during those days of environmental assessment changed everything. Bags of soil, landscaping materials, and supplies supposedly removed for restoration weren't heading to disposal facilities at HOA. They were being hauled straight to Heather's property. The footage was crystal clear. County-marked trucks showing up in broad daylight for official work, a broken bar then sneaking back after dark to unload what looked suspiciously like free deliveries for Heather's benefit. The landscaping materials that were supposedly for restoration were instead ending up in the yard of the very person who had initiated the environmental complaint to Heather. One evening, I sat in my car outside the tackle shop after another brutal day of losing customers and being met with cold shoulders from people I'd once called neighbors. I had to pause, breathe deep, and really face what I was up against. Was I imagining things, letting paranoia take over, or was I staring straight at the most elaborate neighborhood scam I had ever seen? The facts weren't in doubt, the cameras didn't lie. What was creeping in was doubt about myself. Did I have the strength to keep going against someone who seemed to have unlimited influence and community support? Maybe I should have just swallowed my pride, paid the original $50 fine, and avoided all of this. Maybe Sophie had been right to put distance between herself and the storm. The costs were adding up quickly. Calls to my shop had slowed to a trickle. Neighbors I'd greeted for months now looked at me like I was an outlaw. Even my mail carrier avoided eye contact while dropping off envelopes stamped with more official-looking notices and complaints. The social exile cut deeper than the financial losses. It made me ask myself if this fight was really about principle or if I was just being stubborn over something that didn't matter. Was this the hill I'd chosen to die in, all lake access rights? And was it worth losing my place in the community for? But the deeper I dug into Heather's supposed environmental claims, the more things didn't add up. The nesting season she cited didn't line up with the breeding cycles of any local bird species. The so-called assessment crew spent more time taking random photographs than doing real studies. And every time I pressed for a timeline of when the restrictions would be lifted, the finish date mysteriously shifted further away. It was starting to look like Heather's plan wasn't about protecting the environment at all. It was about buying time, tightening her grip, and rallying more neighbors to her side under the perfect, untouchable excuse of environmental protection. Then Sophie approached me. She showed up at the coffee shop, nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if she expected to be followed. Sliding into the booth across from me, she whispered, "I need to tell you something." She explained that the contractor payment schedules she had shared before were only part of the story. There were more records stretching back almost 5 years. Heather had been collecting environmental fees and community improvement contributions for nearly half a decade, and most of that money had been funneled into upgrades on her own property. Sophie pulled out her phone and scrolled through photos of receipts, invoices, and work orders. The evidence was damning. Emergency assessments that magically resulted in supplies showing up at Heather's yard, habitat restoration projects that somehow turned into fresh landscaping for her garden, community fund drives that coincided perfectly with major renovations on her house. She explained further half the so-called county environmental workers were actually subcontractors tied to Heather's relatives. They had built a whole network of family connections and shady business deals that allowed them to roll out official-looking enforcement teams whenever they wanted to pressure someone. The web was far larger and more intricate than I had imagined. No wonder Heather could mobilize authorities in hours. But Sophie's final revelation was the worst. She had screenshots of Heather's text messages with her contractor relatives. They joked about milking the environmental angle for all it's worth and keeping the pressure up on me until I caved and paid the fees. They openly discussed using my property ownership claim as an opportunity to escalate the scam and squeeze more money from fearful neighbors desperate to protect the community. This wasn't just a fake HOA anymore. They had weaponized environmental activism, turning it into a cover for extortion. And then my cameras caught the clincher, Heather herself, directing the removal of supposedly hazardous material that later showed up in her own garden beds. That night, reviewing the footage from my car, I realized I finally had enough to blow this scheme wide open. But I also had to face a crushing question. Did I still have the strength to take on an entire system that seemed stacked against me? The social pressure was suffocating. The money drain was relentless. I felt like David staring up at Goliath, but in this version, Goliath had already convinced the whole town that David was the real monster. Have you ever been in that spot of knowing you're right, but the whole world sees you as the villain? That's exactly where I was, because looking at that footage, I saw clearly, this wasn't just a fight against Heather, it was a fight against a network of people whose entire livelihood was built on a lie. And they weren't going to stop without a battle. The evidence was airtight, but the personal cost was nearly unbearable. Tomorrow would decide everything. The county public hearing room felt more like a courtroom than a town hall. Mark had filed a formal complaint with the commissioner's office demanding a review of both the environmental enforcement and Heather's questionable hostile activities. What I thought would be a straightforward evidence presentation had ballooned into something far more serious. A 3-person panel sat at the front, a court reporter typed every word, and legal protocol filled the air like a heavy fog. Heather sat across from me, flanked by what looked like her own attorney and 2 of her contractor relatives. Their smug expressions said it all. They knew this wasn't going to end well. Commissioner Sarah Martinez opened the hearing by stating that the county had received multiple complaints regarding irregular neighborhood governance and the questionable use of environmental resources. "We're here today to establish the facts about property ownership, community authority, and the legitimacy of recent enforcement actions," she said, flipping through a thick folder of documents. Then she turned to me. "Mr. Harris, you requested this hearing to challenge what you allege are fraudulent authority claims and misuse of public resources. Please present your evidence." I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, but sitting at that table with microphones, a court reporter, and legal observers, the weight of everything I was about to reveal pressed heavily on me. I began with the clearest proof, 2 undeniable pieces of evidence that didn't require complicated legal interpretation. First, I presented the official county auction records and survey maps that proved I was the rightful owner of the lake property, complete with water rights and authority over recreational usage. The commissioners examined the papers carefully, compared them with their own records, and confirmed my purchase was both legitimate and comprehensive. The property description explicitly included the entire lake and the surrounding buffer zone. Commissioner Martinez then stated for the record, "Mr. Harris is the legal owner of this body of water and has exclusive authority to set access and usage policies." My second piece of evidence was even more damaging. The financial trail Sophie and I had pieced together, bank statements, contractor invoices, delivery receipts, and work schedule. All of it formed a damning picture of how so-called community environmental funds had been systematically siphoned into personal projects at Heather's residence. Over the last 4 years, I told the panel, about $18,000 were collected for lake maintenance, habitat protection, and environmental compliance. None of that money went to legitimate community improvements. Every dollar was spent on landscaping, irrigation, and property upgrades at Miss Collins' address. But the most devastating discovery wasn't just about the money, it was about legitimacy. My research showed that the neighborhood association Heather had been running never legally existed at all. No incorporation records, no bylaws, no elections, and nothing. Her so-called authority was fabricated from the very beginning. I placed the incorporation search results on the table. Commissioner Martinez, there is no Lakeside Homeowners Association. There never was. Miss Collins has been impersonating a community official and collecting money under false pretenses. The commissioners fell silent as they reviewed the documents. Across the room, Heather's lawyer whispered frantically in her ear, but Heather herself looked pale, shaken like someone who suddenly realized her elaborate scheme had one fatal flaw. Everything of the environmental enforcement threats, the access restrictions, the habitat protection claims had all been orchestrated by someone with absolutely no legal authority. Heather had built her reputation as the responsible leader who kept the neighborhood in order. But the foundation of that image was nothing more than fiction. "Ms. Collins," Commissioner Martinez said firmly, turning her attention directly to Heather, "do you have any documentation that grants you the authority to collect fees or request county environmental enforcement on behalf of residents?" Heather stumbled through excuses about community consensus and informal governance, but it was painfully clear she had nothing official to stand on. The badge system, the citations, the fee collections, every bit of it was an elaborate performance designed to drain money from trusting neighbors. And in that moment, the entire room knew the game was over. The county acted swiftly. Heather's so-called HOA was placed under immediate audit while a legitimate community organization would be formed through proper legal channels. Heather herself was ordered to repay every dollar she had collected and faced heavy state fines for operating a fraudulent organization. Heather was banned from serving on any community board for 5 years and ordered to complete 200 hours of community service, specifically at the very lake she once tried to control. Part of her penalty required her to personally remove every fraudulent HOA sign and false authority marker she had posted, followed by a public apology to be published on the neighborhood forum. Watching her face as the commissioner announced the ruling was the most satisfying moment of the entire process. The once confident enforcer who had blocked my driveway with the clipboard now looked like someone caught impersonating a police officer. She stammered excuses, insisting her intentions were good even if her methods were questionable. But no one believed her anymore. The evidence was undeniable: systematic fraud, betrayal of community trust, and exploitation of environmental concerns for personal financial gain. The panel's final decision confirmed that I had full authority over lake access and usage. However, they also recommended the creation of a legitimate advisory council so that neighbors could voice concerns about recreation and environmental protection. It was a fair balance, acknowledging my property rights while also recognizing the community's genuine interest in responsible resource management. The key difference was that any future organization would be legally incorporated, democratically elected, and subject to strict financial oversight, not run as one person's personal money-making scheme. When that truth struck, I saw the light fade from Heather's eyes. But this was only the beginning of true accountability. What would life look like for someone who had built her entire identity on fake authority and was now forced to confront years of deception? The very next morning, I woke up to see Heather in my driveway again, but this time, there was no badge, no clipboard, just work gloves and a socket wrench set. Under court order, she was required to dismantle every fraudulent HOA sign around the lake, and I was tasked with documenting the process for county compliance. Watching her struggle with rusted bolts as sweat dripped down her forehead was more satisfying than I expected. Each lake access restricted sign she removed felt like justice unfolding in real time. The penalties were thorough. Heather had to repay every cent collected from the fake lake fund, plus interest and administrative costs of over $22,000. State fines for running a fraudulent organization added another $8,000 to her debt, along with all the legal expenses tied to the county's investigation. She was given 60 days to complete financial restitution and 90 days to finish her community service, all of it performed at the lake under supervision to ensure it genuinely benefited environmental upkeep rather than serving as a loophole. Sophie was the first neighbor to approach me afterward. She admitted feeling both embarrassed and relieved. "I can't believe I paid those fees for 2 years without ever asking to see any real documentation," she said, shaking her head. Heather sounded so official it never crossed my mind the association didn't exist. Sophie quickly agreed to join the advisory council I was setting up to create transparent guidelines for lake use and environmental protection. This time, everything would be properly documented, legally incorporated, and subject to true democratic oversight. George Miller's turnaround was more complicated, but ultimately sincere. He appeared at my door with a handwritten apology, explaining how he'd been misled. Heather made it sound like supporting the HOA was about protecting property values and community standards, he admitted, clearly ashamed of his role in the harassment campaign. "I didn't ask the hard questions because I wanted to believe someone was handling the responsibilities I didn't want to deal with." His brother-in-law's landscaping business was facing its own investigation for participating in the fraudulent billing, but George committed himself to helping establish legitimate maintenance procedures for the lake. The new lake use agreement I drafted became everything Heather's counterfeit system pretended to be: transparent, fair, and focused on genuine environmental protection rather than personal enrichment. Fishing and recreation remained free to all residents, but clear rules were set on waste disposal, fire safety, and wildlife protections during sensitive seasons. The advisory council would meet quarterly, issue public reports, and publish financial records detailing exactly how maintenance funds were spent. Most importantly, every leadership role, all leadership positions would now be decided through proper democratic elections, backed by legal oversight and thorough documentation. The installation of the new community signs quickly turned into an unofficial neighborhood celebration. Instead of Heather's harsh "no trespassing" warnings, the new signs proudly welcomed residents to Daniels Lake Community Resource Area, complete with clear usage guidelines and contact details for reporting genuine environmental concerns. Sophie showed up with coffee for everyone who gathered to watch, while George pitched in to help with the installation. Even neighbors who had distanced themselves during the controversy came forward, thanking me for exposing the fraud. The bright orange buoys I placed to mark safe swimming zones stood as a practical symbol of the difference between authentic community stewardship and Heather's fake authority. Throughout the summer, I found great satisfaction in watching Heather complete her court-ordered community service. Every Saturday morning she was required to clear invasive plants, repair trails, and perform real conservation work under direct supervision from county park staff. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had once pretended to be an environmental protector was now being forced to actually do the work she had falsely claimed to lead. She couldn't leave until a ranger signed off on her hours, and she was also required to submit weekly reports detailing her progress and what she had learned about genuine stewardship. The financial penalties cut just as deep. Heather's lavish landscaping had to be partially torn out to help cover the fines. The irrigation system she had installed with fraudulent funds was dismantled and donated to the county parks department for legitimate use. Even her once polished silver sedan was replaced with an older, modest vehicle as she scrambled to meet the court's financial demands. The downsizing of her lifestyle was visible to everyone in the neighborhood, serving as a lasting reminder of the price of betraying community trust. The final chapter of this ordeal unfolded on a crisp autumn morning. I sat by the lake with my fishing rod, enjoying the quiet peace that comes from secure property rights and transparent agreements. Sophie stopped by with coffee. George waved from across the water where he was helping maintain the trails, and new neighbors introduced themselves, asking about fishing rules. The entire social dynamic had flipped. Where I had once been painted as the troublemaker, I was now seen as the one who had shielded the community from a calculated fraud. I told her from the start, "I'm not in your hoe," I said to Sophie, watching the mist lift off the water. "Turns out your hoe never even existed, but this lakea, it's always been mine. I just let the county paperwork speak for me." The real satisfaction wasn't in winning or even exposing the fraud, it was in building something better afterward. A community structure based on fairness, transparency, democracy, and actual environmental protection, not one person's hidden profits disguised as civic duty. The silence around the lake now felt different and not fearful, not forced, just calm. Some neighbors offered apologies, others quietly moved away, and those who had once been the loudest critics suddenly had nothing to say once the truth was undeniable. That's the nature of fake power. Once exposed to light, it collapses instantly. And maybe the biggest lesson is this: you don't need to shout to be heard. You just need evidence, patience, and the courage to push back when everyone else stays silent. If you've ever had to stand your ground against fake authority or even just watched it play out, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if this story spoke to you, you can always tap the little thanks button below to help keep Anna Drama Nest going. Until next time, you stay sharp, trust your instincts, and whenever someone claims to represent the community, don't be afraid to ask for receipts. That's it for now from Anna Drama Nest. Make sure you're subscribed and the bell's on.